Hey guys, welcome to today's lesson, which is on biogeochemical cycles. We've talked about the water cycle before, but for today we're going to talk about nutrient cycling. So in the movie Lion King, which I hope that you've all seen, there's a song about the circle of life, and while it's a beautiful song and all the animals are gathering and it's just wonderful, really the circle is referring to biogeochemical cycles. There's even a part where Simba's dad briefly describes biogeochemical cycles. He says, "When we die, our bodies become the grass, and the antelope eat the grass, and so we are all connected in the great circle of life." And this is kind of like a simple version of biogeochemical cycles. Do you guys remember the laws of thermodynamics? So that basically said, one, energy is never created or destroyed, it's just changed from one form to another. So there's also a version of that for matter, which says that matter cannot be created or destroyed, it just changes forms. So therefore, the biogeochemical cycles are just the processes of molecules changing from one form to another, moving through living and non-living reservoirs on Earth. That second part just means that every time it changes forms, it ends up somewhere else, in a different reservoir. And the reservoir could include the ocean, the atmosphere, the plants, just continuously moving and changing. As you already know, water cycles, right? It's not destroyed or created. It just changes forms. So two things that cycle that we'll focus on today are the nutrients nitrogen and phosphorus. Before we talk about the nitrogen cycle, I want you to take a deep breath. Now breathe out. 78% of what you breathed in was nitrogen, which makes up the majority of the gas in our atmosphere. So obviously there's a lot of nitrogen. But the thing is, most living things can't use nitrogen in its gas form, which is N2. The reason we can't use it is because 1, N2 doesn't get stuck in the soil, it's in the atmosphere. So plants can use it, plants can't use it, which means that animals won't be able to get it when they eat plants. The other thing is that N2, in its gaseous form, is not very reactive, so it's hard to get it to make other compounds. So overall, most nitrogen is not available in a usable form, which is why we say it's a key limiting factor for plant growth. Ugh, go, come on. All right. So nitrogen in the air can't be used by plants, but through the nitrogen cycle, it's converted into forms that can be used. Here are the 5 main steps. We're going to talk about each of these one by one. Don't worry if you don't get them the first time I talk about it. It takes some time. It takes some time to memorize them. Also, there is a blank copy of the nitrogen cycle diagram in your guided notes, and I want you to try to add each step to your diagram in the correct place. The first step is nitrogen fixation. So, as I said before, N2 can't be used by plants. So we need to fix N2 and turn it into ammonium, which is the raw material for getting nitrogen into other molecules. This can happen 2 ways. One, through bacteria that live in the root nodules of plants, especially legumes, which include soybeans, alfalfa, peas, or through lightning strikes. Pretty cool. Nitrogen can be fixed through lightning strikes. But obviously, we don't have lightning strikes happening all the time, so we rely very heavily on these bacteria, which are called nitrogen-fixing bacteria. Ammonification is when plants or animals die or poop, and then the decomposers take that material and turns the amino acids back into ammonia and returns it to the soil. So that's another way that we can get ammonia, is through things pooping or dying. So excretion is when animals release nitrogen back to the soil by pooping, and ingestion is when animals get nitrogen by eating plants and other animals. So assimilation is just when plants take up nitrate or ammonium ions from the soil via their root hairs. And nitrification is when the ammonium is converted into nitrites and nitrates by the bacteria in the soil. The reason this is important is because nitrates and nitrites are the forms that can be most directly used by the plant. Denitrification is the opposite of nitrification. So basically when nitrates are converted back into nitrogen, or N2. So why do bacteria do this? It's because when there's low oxygen, bacteria respire or breathe nitrate as a substitute. It's not their favorite thing to breathe in, but it'll do so that they don't die. How do we get more nitrogen? I mean, we obviously grow crops at a much faster rate than normally happens in the ecosystem, and we need nitrogen. So there's three main ways. One is through applying chemical fertilizers, which are also known as synthetic fertilizers. And the way we do this is basically by mimicking the nitrogen cycle in a lab. The second way is to apply organic fertilizer, which is animal poop, on plants. And the third is through growing legumes. Again, these include alfalfa, soybeans, peas. And the reason this works is because the bacteria that can fix nitrogen tend to like to live in the nodules, the root nodules of these plants. So if you grow more legumes, then you have more nitrogen-fixing bacteria. There's also ways that we unintentionally add nitrogen to the ecosystem. The first is through basically producing a lot of cattle. They release a ton of nitrate, especially in feedlots. And also, our own sewage adds nitrogen, because if we dispose of our sewage in pipes that eventually lead to the ocean, that nitrogen is going to be eaten by something, right? So to make sure that you do well on the upcoming quiz and the final, you'd want to make sure that you know what nitrogen fixation is, why it's important for living things, what the role of bacteria in the nitrogen cycle is, and how humans impact the nitrogen cycle. So take a minute, and I want people to volunteer to answer any of these questions. Cool. Now you can check to see if you filled in your diagram correctly. Again, this is not easy stuff, but if you look at the diagram for a while, it'll start to make a little more sense. That's enough about the nitrogen cycle. Let's talk about the phosphorus cycle. So before we talk about that cycle, you want to remind yourself of what things contain phosphorus. And a lot of these things are basically just protein-rich food items, right? So fish, cheese, eggs. But they didn't just appear there, right? That protein originated from, well, not the protein, the phosphate originated from rocks. So unique features about the phosphorus cycle. One is that it's the slowest of all biogeochemical cycles. The reason it's so slow is because it involves rocks, either making rocks or breaking down rocks, and that obviously takes hella long. It's also the only cycle that doesn't directly involve the atmosphere, because phosphorus isn't really found in the air. It's useful to know that the largest reservoir of phosphorus is sedimentary rock. And if you think back to maybe your middle school science classes, you'll remember that sedimentary rock is formed through sediment building up and compacting over time in rivers. And phosphorus is very important, right? Phosphate is needed for DNA, RNA, and ATP, without which we wouldn't exist. Surprise, there's another empty diagram that I want you to fill out as you follow along. And again, we'll show the answers at the end. Here are some steps of the phosphorus cycle. There's burial and compaction. So phosphates that settle in water can build up and form rocks over time. And when the tectonic plates of the Earth collide, you get mountains. And when you get mountains through what's called geologic uplift, you essentially bring phosphate back to the surface to be worn down again. This wearing down or weathering is called erosion, and that's how phosphate is released into the water. Assimilation, again, is when plants take up phosphates from the soil, and ingestion is when animals eat plants to obtain phosphorus. So pretty much the same as for the nitrogen cycle. Excretion, also exactly the same for the nitrogen cycle, is when animals release phosphates through their waste, through their poop. And decomposition is when a living organism dies and organic molecules are broken down and returned to the soil. So now you can check your diagram, see if you filled things in correctly. You might notice that the phosphorus cycle is much simpler than the nitrogen cycle. And that's because it doesn't really involve the atmosphere, so everything is pretty much on the ground or in the water. You'll also notice that a lot of the steps, such as ingestion, assimilation, are identical for the phosphorus cycle as to the nitrogen cycle. So it's not all new stuff. How do we get the high amount of phosphates that we need? Again, through chemical fertilizer, and that actually depends on mining. So we need to mine rocks to get the phosphates, and we use that phosphate in chemical fertilizer, or through organic fertilizer, which is, again, animal poop. Once again, we tend to add a lot of nutrients to the ecosystem without even trying to. For example, the detergents we use contain lots of phosphates, and that is flushed into the water supply. And again, our human sewage contains high amounts of phosphates. Back to the previous point, a lot of companies are trying to lower the amount of phosphates that are in their detergents. That way, there's not so much that's released once it's used. Here are some questions to check for understanding. If you want to do well on the final, you'll want to know what the largest reservoir of phosphorus is in the cycle, why farmers should care about phosphorus, and how we as humans impact the phosphorus cycle. So before we end, I want to talk about why it's important that we don't release too many nutrients into the water. Because you might have wondered, if we need nitrogen and phosphorus to grow plants, what's so bad about fertilizer use? And basically, something happens called eutrophication, and that's when by releasing too many nutrients into the water, there's a population explosion of plant and bacteria. And bacteria can actually eat up all the oxygen in the water. And that's not good because living things generally need oxygen. So even though we do need nutrients to grow plants, too much of it is also a bad thing. So that's it for today. Go over these notes. It's not all easy content, especially the diagrams, but it'll eventually make more sense, I promise. Bye, guys.